Hello, friends. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Here, I share a brand new story every day. If you enjoy my videos, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's dive into today's story. Jake had been looking forward to this night for weeks. The latest horror film was showing, and he couldn't wait to immerse himself in the spine-chilling experience. Living in California with his parents, he rarely got the chance to spend time alone, and tonight was his night. He chose a late-night show, thinking the theater would be less crowded. Arriving at the theater, Jake was surprised to find the place almost packed. He found a seat near the middle, the perfect spot to lose himself in the movie. As the lights dimmed and the preview started, he felt the familiar rush of excitement. He barely noticed the world around him. So engrossed was he in the unfolding story on the screen. Halfway through the movie, an announcement for an interval broke the spell. Jake stretched and looked around. His blood ran cold. The once packed theater was now empty. Rows upon rows of seats, around 200 to 300 of them, were completely vacant. He was alone in the dark. Panic set in. Jake stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. How could everyone have left without him noticing? He quickly made his way to the exit, the eerie silence of the theater pressing in on him. Once outside, he took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. He pulled out his phone and booked a cab. Within minutes, the cab arrived. Jake climbed in, grateful for the normalcy of the situation. The cab driver, an older man, was unusually silent. Jake didn't mind. He just wanted to get home. As the cab moved through the dark, empty streets, Jake's mind began to wander back to the theater. Suddenly, something caught his eye. The cab driver's hands on the steering wheel looked odd. They seemed twisted, almost as if they were bent backward. Jake's first thought was that the driver might have a disability. He dismissed it, but a growing unease gnawed at him. A few miles down the road, the driver spoke for the first time. "Are you all right back there?" he asked, his voice a raspy whisper. As he turned his head, Jake's heart nearly stopped. The driver's neck twisted around completely, his face now looking at Jake with a sinister smile. His head spun like a ball, defying all logic. Jake's fear reached a peak. He fumbled for the door handle and threw himself out of the moving cab. He hit the ground hard, rolling to a stop on the deserted road. He scrambled to his feet, the cab disappearing into the night. Breathing heavily, Jake pulled out his phone and booked another cab. He stood there, shivering in the silence, waiting. Another cab arrived, and Jake, desperate to get away, climbed in without a second thought. The new driver was just as silent, but this time, Jake couldn't shake the feeling of dread. As they drove, he noticed something horrifyingly familiar. The driver's hands were also twisted backward. Jake's heart raced. Was he hallucinating? The driver turned around, his neck snapping with the movement, revealing the same unnatural twist as the previous one. Jake yelled, "Stop the car!" and leaped out before the cab could come to a complete stop. He ran down the empty road, his footsteps echoing in the night. The city that never slept was eerily quiet. No cars, no people, nothing but darkness. He reached a small, all-night diner, the neon sign flickering like a beacon. Jake stumbled inside, panting and terrified. The place was empty, except for the waitress behind the counter. She looked up, her eyes unnaturally wide and unblinking. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice too sweet, too calm. Jake backed away, feeling the walls close in. He turned and ran out of the diner, back into the deserted streets. He didn't stop running until he reached his house. He burst through the door, locking it behind him, and collapsed on the floor. Chapter 2. The Nightmare Deepens. Jake's parents found him there the next morning, still shaking, his eyes wide with terror. He tried to explain what happened, but it sounded too crazy, too impossible. They assured him it was just a bad dream, a trick of his overactive imagination. But Jake knew the truth. The theater, the cab drivers, the diner, all of it was real. And somewhere out there, in the dark corners of the night, they were still waiting. Days passed, but the fear lingered. Jake couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking presence. Every whisper of the wind sounded like a sinister voice. He started to avoid going out at night, but even the daylight offered no solace. One evening, as he sat in his room trying to distract himself with video games, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from an unknown number. "Did you enjoy the show?" Jake's blood ran cold. His hands trembled as he typed a reply. "Who is this?" The response was immediate. "Come back and find out." Jake's heart pounded. He knew he should ignore it, but a part of him was curious, desperate for answers. He decided to go back to the theater, this time during the day. Chapter 3. The Return. The theater looked ordinary in the daylight, almost reassuring. Jake walked in, half expecting everything to be normal. But the moment he stepped inside, he felt the same eerie chill. The lobby was empty, and the air felt thick with anticipation. He approached the ticket counter, but there was no one there. A flickering screen displayed the movies currently showing, seeing about the horror film from that night was listed, but the showtime was at midnight. Jake knew he had to wait. He wandered around the nearby area trying to pass the time. As the sun set, his anxiety grew. Finally, it was time. He returned to the theater, the neon sign casting an ominous glow. Chapter 4. The Midnight Show. The lobby was empty again, but the theater doors were open. Jake hesitated before stepping inside. The room was dark, and the seats were empty, just like before. He took a deep breath and sat in the same spot. The movie started, and once again he was drawn in. The scenes played out like before, but this time he felt a growing sense of dread. Halfway through, the interval announcement came and the lights dimmed. Jake looked around, expecting the emptiness, but this time the seats were filled with shadowy figures, all staring at him. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their faces were hidden in darkness. Panic surged through him. He stood up and stumbled toward the exit, but the doors were locked. He pounded on them, screaming for help, but no one came. He turned back to the theater, and the figures were gone. The screen flickered, and a distorted face appeared, filling the entire screen. It was the cab driver, his twisted hands reaching out. "You can't leave," the voice echoed. "You're one of us now." Jake's vision blurred, and he felt himself being pulled toward the screen. The theater dissolved into darkness, and he found himself in a dimly lit room, surrounded by those same shadowy figures. Chapter 5. The Revelation. The figures closed in, and Jake's mind raced. "What do you want from me?" he shouted. One of the figures stepped forward, its form shifting and changing. "We are the lost," it said in a hollow voice. "Trapped between worlds, you watched our story, and now you're part of it." Jake shook his head, trying to deny it. This can't be real. The figure's face morphed into a familiar one, the waitress from the diner. "It's as real as the fear you felt," she said. "You can't escape us. You belong here now." Jake backed away, but the shadows closed in. He felt their cold touch, their whispers echoing in his mind. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The darkness consumed him, and he felt himself fading away. Epilogue. Days later, the theater was bustling with people again. The horror film was still showing, and the audience was engrossed in the story. Among them sat a new figure, eyes wide with terror, unable to leave. The show goes on, and the lost continue to watch, waiting for the next soul to join them in the endless night. Ella had always been captivated by the charm of old theaters. Growing up in a small California town, she often found solace in the grand historic buildings that dotted the area. So, when she received an invitation to attend a special midnight show at the newly restored Majestic Theater, she couldn't resist. The invitation arrived in an ornate envelope, sealed with a wax stamp bearing an intricate design of a theater mask. Inside, a beautifully printed card read, "Join us for an exclusive midnight performance at the Majestic Theater. Experience the final act like never before. One night only." Ella was intrigued. She had heard rumors about the Majestic Theater being haunted, stories of ghostly actors and eerie performances, but she was drawn to the mystery and excitement of the unknown. She decided to go, eager to witness whatever secrets the theater held. Chapter 2. The Majestic Theater. The Majestic Theater stood at the edge of town, a grand edifice that had once been the jewel of the performing arts scene. Over the years, it had fallen into disrepair, but recent renovations had restored it to its former glory. Ella arrived just before midnight. The theater's marquee blazed with light, casting long shadows on the empty street. She stepped inside, the heavy doors creaking open. The lobby was a marvel of ornate architecture, with grand chandeliers and plush red carpeting. A few other guests milled about, each looking as curious as Ella felt. An usher, dressed in a vintage uniform, approached her with a polite smile. "Welcome to the Majestic Theater," he said. "Please follow me to your seat." Ella followed him down a dimly lit hallway, the soft glow of wall sconces guiding their way. They entered the main auditorium, and Ella's breath caught in her throat. The theater was magnificent, with rows of plush seats facing a grand stage. A sense of anticipation hung in the air. Chapter 3: The Midnight Show. Ella took her seat near the center of the theater, surrounded by a scattering of other guests. The lights dimmed and a hush fell over the audience. The heavy velvet curtains parted, revealing the stage bathed in a haunting, ethereal light. The performance began with a monologue by a lone actor, dressed in an elaborate costume from a bygone era. His voice echoed through the theater, rich and melodious, weaving a tale of love, betrayal, and tragedy. Ella was mesmerized, completely absorbed in the story. As the performance continued, strange things began to happen. The temperature in the theater dropped, and Ella could see her breath in the air. Shadows flickered at the edges of her vision, and she felt an unsettling presence behind her. During a particularly intense scene, the actor on stage seemed to lock eyes with Ella. His expression shifted, and he spoke directly to her. "Do you believe in the power of the stage?" he asked, his voice a haunting whisper. Ella's heart pounded. She wanted to respond, but her voice was caught in her throat. The actor continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "Tonight you will witness the final act, a performance that transcends time and space. Do you dare to stay?" Ella felt a chill run down her spine. She nodded, unable to tear her gaze away from the actor. Chapter 4: The Haunted Past. The performance took a darker turn, the story delving into the history of the theater itself. It told of a troupe of actors who had once performed at the Majestic, led by a charismatic and ambitious director named Victor Blackwood. Victor had been obsessed with creating the perfect performance, pushing his actors to their limits. One fateful night during a particularly demanding production, a tragic accident occurred. The leading actress, Evelyn Hart, fell from a high platform and died on stage. The theater closed its doors shortly after, and the troupe disbanded. As the tale unfolded, Ella felt a growing sense of dread. The actor on stage seemed to transform, his features becoming more sinister, his voice filled with malice. "The spirits of the past still linger here," he said. "Evelyn's soul remains trapped, yearning for the final curtain call. And Victor, driven mad by his guilt, haunts these halls, searching for a way to undo his mistakes." Ella glanced around, her fellow audience members appearing as entranced as she was. The atmosphere in the theater grew heavier, the shadows deepening. Chapter 5: The Encounter. As the performance reached its climax, the actor on stage extended a hand toward Ella. "Come forward," he beckoned. "Join us on the stage and witness the final act." Ella hesitated, but something compelled her to stand. She walked down the aisle, her footsteps echoing in the silent theater. The other guests seemed to fade into the background, their faces becoming indistinct. She stepped onto the stage, the bright lights blinding her momentarily. The actor took her hand, his touch cold and unyielding. "Do you see them?" he whispered, his breath icy against her ear. Ella looked out into the audience and gasped. The seats were filled with ghostly figures, their eyes fixed on the stage. She recognized them from the stories, Evelyn Harkwood and the rest of the ill-fated troupe. The actor led her to the center of the stage, where a spotlight illuminated a large, ornate mirror. The glass was cracked, and an eerie light pulsed from within. "Look into the mirror," the actor instructed. "See the truth of the Majestic Theater." Ella peered into the mirror, and the reflection twisted and warped. She saw scenes from the past, the final performance, the tragic accident, and Victor's descent into madness. The images played out like a nightmare, vivid and horrifying. Chapter 6: The Final Act. The actor's grip tightened on Ella's hand. "You are part of the final act now," he said. "Only by facing the truth can you free the spirits trapped here." Ella's heart raced. She knew she had to do something, but fear paralyzed her. The ghostly audience watched in silence, their eyes pleading for release. Summoning all her courage, Ella stepped closer to the mirror. She felt a strange energy pulling her in, and the world around her seemed to blur. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cracked glass. A surge of memories flooded her mind. She saw herself as Evelyn Hart, standing on this very stage the night of the accident. She felt the fall, the pain, and the final breath leaving her body. She was Evelyn, trapped in a cycle of torment, but she also saw Victor, his anguish and regret. He had been consumed by his obsession, unable to forgive himself for Evelyn's death. His spirit lingered, desperate for redemption. Ella knew what she had to do. She turned to the actor, now fully aware of his true identity, Victor Blackwood. "Victor," she said, her voice steady, "it's time to let go. Release yourself and Evelyn from this torment." Victor's eyes filled with sorrow. "I can't," he whispered. "I don't know how." Ella took his hands in hers, the coldness slowly fading. "You must forgive yourself," she said. "Accept what happened and find peace." The theater trembled, the shadows receding. The ghostly audience began to fade, their expressions softening. Victor's grip loosened, and he looked at Ella with gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely audible. Ella felt a warmth envelop her, and the mirror shattered, releasing a brilliant light. She closed her eyes, feeling herself being lifted, the weight of the past dissolving. Ella awoke to the sound of applause. She found herself back in the auditorium, surrounded by the remaining guests. The theater was bathed in morning light, the oppressive atmosphere gone. She stood, feeling a sense of relief and clarity. The Majestic Theater had been cleansed, its spirits finally at peace. Ella knew she had witnessed something extraordinary, a performance that transcended the boundaries of reality. As she left the theater, the sun rising in the sky, Ella felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew she would continue to explore the mysteries of the past, seeking out the stories that needed to be told. The Majestic Theater stood as a testament to the power of forgiveness and the enduring spirit of the arts. And for Ella, it was the beginning of a new chapter, filled with endless possibilities. Ben had always been fascinated by the history of his small Californian town. Nestled between the mountains and the coast, it was rich with stories of gold rushes, forgotten mines, and old legends. One tale that particularly captivated him was that of the long-abandoned Crescent Playhouse, a once grand theater that had been closed for decades. The Crescent Playhouse was rumored to be haunted by the spirit of a renowned actor, Richard Hale, who had vanished during a performance on Halloween night, 1923. The Playhouse was shuttered soon after, and it had stood silent ever since, a decaying monument to its mysterious past. One crisp autumn evening, as Ben walked home from his part-time job at the local library, he found an envelope lying on his doorstep. The envelope was old and yellowed, sealed with a wax stamp bearing the emblem of the Crescent Playhouse. Inside was a single, elegantly penned note. "Join us for a special midnight performance at the Crescent Playhouse. One night only. Experience the legend." Ben's curiosity got the better of him. He had always wanted to explore the Playhouse, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity. He decided to attend, hoping to uncover the secrets that had shrouded the theater for nearly a century. Chapter 2: The Enchanted Theater. The Crescent Playhouse loomed large in the moonlight, its once grand facade now crumbling and overgrown with ivy. Ben approached the entrance, feeling a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The heavy wooden doors creaked open as if inviting him inside. The lobby was eerily silent, illuminated by the dim glow of old gas lamps. Dust motes danced in the air, and the faint scent of decay lingered. Ben could hear the distant sound of music echoing through the corridors, guiding him toward the main auditorium. As he entered the auditorium, he was struck by the theater's haunting beauty. The seats were draped in cobwebs, and the chandeliers hung like ghostly sentinels from the ceiling. The stage, however, was impeccably preserved, as if waiting for the curtain to rise. Ben took a seat near the front, his heart pounding with anticipation. The lights dimmed, and the heavy velvet curtains parted to reveal the stage bathed in a ghostly blue light. The music grew louder, and a figure emerged from the shadows. Har. Chapter 3: The Phantom's Tale. The figure was dressed in a vintage tuxedo, complete with a top hat and tails. His eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and his presence commanded the stage. Ben realized with a start that this was Richard Hale, the legendary actor who had disappeared all those years ago. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," Hale began, his voice rich and resonant. "Tonight I shall tell you a tale of love, betrayal, and the curse that binds me to this place." As Hale spoke, the story unfolded like a living memory. He recounted how he had fallen in love with the beautiful leading lady, Isabella Thorne. Their romance was passionate but fraught with jealousy and deceit. Hale's rival, Victor Sinclair, had plotted to sabotage their final performance, leading to a tragic accident that claimed Isabella's life. Desperate and grief-stricken, Hale had made a pact with dark forces to bring her back. The ritual had gone horribly wrong, and Hale found himself trapped between worlds, doomed to haunt the theater for eternity. The audience was spellbound, hanging on Hale's every word. Ben felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the story was not just a performance, but a cry for help. Chapter 4. The Ghostly Audience. As Hale's tale reached its climax, the atmosphere in the theater grew colder. The air was thick with an otherworldly presence, and Ben could see ghostly figures materializing in the seats around him. These were the spirits of the actors and patrons who had perished in the theater's tragic past. Hale's eyes met Ben's, and he seemed to recognize something in him. "You," Hale said, pointing a spectral finger. "You can help me break the curse." Ben stood, his legs trembling. "What do I need to do?" "You must perform the ritual correctly," Hale replied. "But first, you must find the missing pages of the spell book. They are hidden within the theater, scattered by the spirits who wish to keep me bound." Ben nodded, determined to help. He knew he had to act quickly. The spirits were growing restless, and the theater's walls seemed to pulse with dark energy. Chapter 5. The Search for the Pages. Ben began his search, exploring the labyrinthine corridors of the theater. The air grew colder with each step, and he could hear whispers and soft footsteps echoing around him. He entered the dressing rooms, where the ghostly apparitions of actors and actresses rehearsed their lines unaware of his presence. In one room, he found a torn page hidden behind an old mirror. The page was covered in arcane symbols and instructions for the ritual. Ben carefully folded it and continued his search, guided by an inexplicable sense of urgency. He ventured into the basement, where the air was damp and the darkness impenetrable. The faint glow of his flashlight revealed a maze of old props and forgotten scenery. Ben felt a cold hand brush against his shoulder, and he turned to see a ghostly figure pointing to an old trunk. Inside the trunk, he found another page, along with a locket containing a picture of Isabella Thorne. The discovery fueled his determination, and he hurried back to the auditorium, clutching the precious pages. Chapter 6. The Ritual. Ben returned to the stage, where Hale awaited him. The ghostly audience watched in silence, their expressions a mixture of hope and despair. Hale guided Ben through the ritual, reciting the incantations and arranging the pages in the correct order. As Ben chanted the final words, a brilliant light filled the theater. The ghostly figures began to dissolve, their faces serene as they found peace at last. Hale and Isabella appeared at the center of the stage, their hands entwined. "Thank you," Hale whispered, his voice filled with gratitude. "You have freed us." The light intensified, and Ben felt himself being lifted off the stage. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the theater's dark history lift from his shoulders. Ben awoke outside the Crescent Playhouse, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. The theater stood silent and empty, its haunted past finally laid to rest. He felt a sense of accomplishment and relief, knowing he had played a part in freeing the trapped spirits. As he walked home, Ben couldn't help but glance back at the theater one last time. The old building seemed to glow with a newfound warmth, a beacon of hope and renewal. He knew he would never forget the night he spent at the Crescent Playhouse and the phantom who had guided him to uncover the truth. The legend of Richard Hale and the Crescent Playhouse would live on, but now it was a story of redemption and release rather than tragedy. And for Ben, it marked the beginning of a new chapter filled with the promise of adventure and discovery. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like, comment, and share the video. See you next time.